The year 1918 marked a turning point in history. World War I, a conflict of unprecedented brutality, was coming to an end. The mighty empires of Europe, weakened by years of fighting, began to crumble. The first to fall was the Russian Empire. Revolution in 1917 led to the Bolsheviks taking power and Russia's withdrawal from the war. This was a significant blow to the Allied powers, but it also signaled the beginning of the end for the old European order. Austria-Hungary, a patchwork of different nationalities, was also on the verge of collapse. Nationalist movements, fueled by years of oppression and the promise of self-determination, gained momentum. The Ottoman Empire, once a formidable power, was also in its death throes. Its defeat in the Middle East had weakened its grip on power, and nationalist uprisings further destabilized the empire. By the fall of 1918, the Ottoman Empire, like Austria-Hungary, was ready to collapse. These empires were not the only casualties of the war. The German war machine, which had seemed invincible in the early years of the conflict, was also nearing exhaustion. The Allied blockade had taken a toll on the German economy, and the German people were war-weary. The arrival of American troops on the Western Front in 1917 had tipped the balance of power in favor of the Allies. By the summer of 1918, the German army was in retreat. The German High Command, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, began to seek an armistice. They hoped to negotiate a peace settlement based on US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which they believed offered a more lenient peace than that offered by France and Great Britain. However, the Allies were determined to punish Germany for its role in the war. They demanded unconditional surrender. As the German army faltered, its allies began to seek separate peace agreements. Bulgaria, facing a renewed Allied offensive on the Macedonian front, was the first to sign an armistice on September 29, 1918. The Ottoman Empire, its forces in disarray, followed suit on October 30, 1918. Austria-Hungary, torn apart by internal strife, signed an armistice with the Allies on November 3, 1918. Germany was now isolated. The collapse of its allies, coupled with the deteriorating situation on the Western Front, made its position untenable. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II, facing pressure from the German military and public opinion, abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The following day, a new German government, led by Friedrich Ebert, was formed. On November 11, 1918, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the Armistice of Compiègne was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France. The armistice came into effect at 11 o'clock in the morning, bringing an end to the hostilities. The guns fell silent and the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Great War, as it was known at the time, was over. But the peace that followed would prove to be just as consequential and in many ways just as devastating. The armistice marked the end of the fighting, but it did not bring peace. The world was in chaos. Empires had crumbled, millions lay dead, and economies were in ruins. The task of rebuilding Europe and establishing a lasting peace now fell to the victors, but the seeds of future conflict had already been sown. In January 1919, representatives from the victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris to negotiate the terms of the peace treaties. The Paris Peace Conference, presided over by the leaders of France, Britain, the United States, and Italy, was a complex and often contentious affair. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed on Germany, was particularly harsh. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, a clause that caused deep resentment among the German population. The treaty also imposed heavy reparations payments on Germany, crippling its economy for years to come. Furthermore, Germany was stripped of its colonies and forced to cede territory to France, Belgium, Denmark, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to ensure a lasting peace, but it had the opposite effect. The harsh terms imposed on Germany created a sense of humiliation and resentment that would fester in the years to come. The treaty also failed to address the underlying causes of the war, such as nationalism and imperialism, setting the stage for future conflict. Section 4. Redrawing the map: New Nations, New Conflicts. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires resulted in the creation of several new states in Europe and the Middle East. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania emerged as independent nations. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled, and much of its territory in the Middle East was divided between Britain and France under the Mandate system. While the creation of these new states fulfilled the nationalist aspirations of many, it also created new problems. The boundaries of the new states were often drawn hastily and without regard for historical, ethnic, or religious considerations. This led to ethnic tensions, border disputes, and population displacements that would plague Europe for decades to come. The redrawing of the map of Europe and the Middle East after World War I was a complex and imperfect process. While it satisfied some national aspirations, it also created new sources of conflict that would contribute to the instability of the post-war world. Section 5. A Flawed Peace, the League of Nations. In an attempt to prevent future wars, US President Woodrow Wilson championed the creation of the League of Nations. The League was intended to be an international organization where nations could resolve their disputes through diplomacy and collective security rather than through war. However, the League was flawed from the outset. The United States, despite being its chief proponent, failed to join the League of Nations due to isolationist sentiment in the US Senate. This was a major blow to the League's credibility and effectiveness. Moreover, the League lacked its own military force and relied on member states to enforce its decisions. This proved to be a major weakness, as demonstrated by the League's failure to prevent Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The League of Nations, despite its noble intentions, ultimately failed to prevent World War II. Its weaknesses, coupled with the rise of aggressive powers like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, rendered it ineffective in the face of determined aggressors. The League's failure was a tragedy for the world, but it also provided valuable lessons about the challenges of international cooperation and the importance of collective security. Section 6. The Long Shadow of 1918. The year 1918 marked the end of an era. World War I shattered the old European order, redrawing the map of Europe and the Middle East and ushering in an era of uncertainty and instability. The Treaty of Versailles, while intended to ensure peace, created more problems than it solved, leaving a legacy of resentment and instability. The League of Nations, weakened by its flaws and the lack of US participation, proved unable to prevent the outbreak of another world war. The lessons of 1918 are as relevant today as they were a century ago. Nationalism, imperialism, and the failure of international cooperation can have devastating consequences. The search for a lasting peace remains as urgent as ever. As we remember the centenary of the end of World War I, we must also remember the lessons of the past and work towards a future where peace and cooperation prevail.